Surtees was being taken to race meetings before he was conscious of where he was when he was a tiny little toddler.
His father gave him a box of parts and said, put this together and you can race it.
He demonstrated his street fighting skills on circuit.
Lots of animosity developed between John Surtees and Dragoni.
His kidneys were smashed up, his back, his pelvis.
He was so race prepared and so race aware.
It was John's influence that was required to bring Ferrari up to date.
Team Surtees built 100 racing cars in those 8 seasons. That is a lot of racing cars.
It was a tour de force. Everyone just watched it, jaws dropping.
A world-class racing driver.
As a young lad, when I was evacuated in the war, I picked up a magazine, which my father had kept, and saw this picture of George Meyer flying through the air, going down Bray Hill. And it fascinated me.
On the 11th of February, 1934, John Surtees was born into a family with a lifelong passion for speed. During a time of small budgets and huge innovations, men like John Surtees pushed technology to the limit and often far beyond. At a time of great risk and even greater courage, one man was the only man to become a world champion on 2 wheels and 4.
Because his father was a successful grass track racer on a motorcycle sidecar outfit in the 30s, he was always around speed. And his mother was almost, I would say, an unusual woman for her time.
John's mother was an amazing woman, actually. She used to ride a Vincent HRD, and she could turn it over with, kick-start it with her foot, which most men can't do it. And she would put the children in the sidecar, drive them around. She always drove too fast, always. They'd be at a race meeting and she'd hop on her Vincent and say to the mechanics, I'll race you to Hyde Park Corner, and she always won. So the speed didn't just come from his father, his mother, and she was a very focused, organised, determined woman as well. So it came from both his parents, really. And she would often drive the lorry and John would sleep in the back if they were going from one race meeting to another.
Father was a motorcycle dealer, a successful racer in sidecars, and John's first race as his dad's sidecar passenger resulted in them being disqualified because he was underage.
They competed in this twisty sprint. The officials found out and they were disqualified, but that was John's first competitive event. He certainly threw the lad into the deep end on lots of occasions.
His father, my grandfather, gave him a box of parts and said, put this together and you can race it. And so that's really continued through his entire life, and I think he just had a complete innate sense of needing to be building something.
During John's first solo race on his self-built Excelsior, he fell off so often, his father suggested the 500cc was too much to handle. They struck a deal for a Triumph Tiger 70 instead. During his first road race on the Tiger at Brands Hatch, he led in the final, but came off when it started to rain. It was an important lesson. Speed alone would not make him a winner.
When John Surtees became an apprentice at the Vincent Motorcycle Company, I mean, the people who worked there were people such as Phil Vincent, who created the Vincent, a legendary Australian engineer called Phil Irving, who later designed the Brabham V8 Formula One engine, a great rider and development engineer called George Brown. The Vincent Motorcycle Company was like an epicenter of advanced motorcycle thinking. So John is serving his apprenticeship as an engineer there, getting used to working all the tooling in the company, but also absorbing all this racing knowledge.
That apprenticeship was a great asset to his racing career because he knew all about carburation, ignition, valve timing, whereas the road racers today know nothing about the mechanics. But John was quite into the basics, the fundamentals, the setup of bikes, and I rode Nortons that John set up, and they were just so easy to ride because of the carburation and how he had got them suspension set up. This is the Black Shadow, which John's father raced quite successfully too. 1000cc V-twin overhead valve, very, very fast bike. This was the fastest production bike in the world at that time. I think they were guaranteed 140 miles an hour. That was in 1950, so you can imagine that they broke many world records. And great, great bike. John raced the 500 edition, which was the Grey Flash.
He loved the whole, building and creative side, but he really lived to race. Racing was what it was all about. He was fiercely competitive in everything. I think he could never quite believe his luck that he managed to do something and be successful at it, and he absolutely adored it.
As soon as he rode on a road racing circuit, which was at the newly opened Brands Hatch, he thought, this is it, this is what I want to do. And from there on, it was road racing only. His first successful road racing bike was known as a Vincent Grey Flash. That was a 500cc bike, top speed of about 110 miles an hour. And he and his dad got that from the Vincent Works and tuned and developed it. So that bike gave John his first ever wins in road racing.
I started building this bike from parts of my father's Black Lightning, which had blown up in 1949. And when I got to the point of dicing with Jeff Duke with the Giliras, I thought, I've got to build a bike. I couldn't afford a Norton. I had a Grey Flash at the time. I've got to build a bike which will beat Jeff Duke. So I built this engine up to the same specification as the one which Rowley Free won the world record with. And I was an apprentice at Vincent's at the time, so of course that was quite convenient.
And in his second race at Aberdare Park in Wales, he won.
That was probably the most important race in my life because it meant the day I came together with a piece of machinery and fully became part of it. And that stood me in good stead for the rest of my career.
That day, the bike spoke to him. He pushed the Vincent to its absolute limits for the rest of the season. In 1951, at the Thruxton Festival race, having led for the first 7 laps, John finished second behind the legendary Jeff Duke. Surtees was determined to beat him one day.
So the Norton company was selling a racing bike called the Manx Norton, which was superior to a Vincent Grey Flash. So he and his dad agreed he had to have a Manx Norton. Really, the Manx Norton period started late in 52, and then from 53 onwards, and they paid £280 for a brand new Manx Norton, which in those days was a lot of money. Apparently, John could win £5 for winning a race. So if you divide 280 by 5, it comes out at 56. He had to win 56 races in effect to pay for that bike.
With his new Manx Norton, John headed to his first championship race at the 1952 Ulster Grand Prix. He came in 6th, but rode so well, the Norton team immediately took an interest.
His race principles were to get an electric start and get away and get going, and the rest then were struggling always to catch up with him. In those days, you got to look back, and 7 laps of the TT, and then Northwest 200 miles, and today they're doing 50-mile races, and 10 o'clock start, and it was gone, hail, rain or snow, and the leathers were rubbish, Today, safety, they've got all protection, air bags in the leathers that explode before you hit the ground. And in those days, we had just one layer of leather, and, that wasn't a lot of protection if you were hitting a wall at 100 mile an hour, you know.
He was asked by Joe Craig, who was the very autocratic team manager of the Factory Norton team, to ride a Factory Norton in the Isle of Man. John had previously arranged with Dr. Joe Ehrlich, the owner of the EMC company, to race one of Joe's 125 two-stroke. And he felt that he could not go back on his word. Unfortunately, the forks collapsed at a very fast corner just after Bluff Bridge. John crashed and broke his wrist.
Joe Craig was absolutely furious. Joe Craig wouldn't even speak to him for about 2 years, you know, because Joe Craig had got these special bikes for the TT that John was going to race, and he would have won. And apparently when he was on the ferry back to the mainland after practice, he was crying on the boat, you know.
He lost the opportunity for a Norton factory ride, but not one for self-pity. John picked himself up and started winning again. His first Grand Prix win at Ulster in 1955 came when he was still working at Vincent's. John also had numerous wins on the REG, an innovative homespun 250cc created by British racer Bob Geeson.
John was extremely patriotic, and he wanted a British bike to be successful. That's why he raced for Norton. And he wanted to race the REG against the foreign competition, Moto Guzzi, NSU, bikes like that. And John had by then become a notable top-line racer in Britain. And he asked Bob Geeson to let him ride the REG, which he did.
The REG, Reg Geeson Special. Reg worked with John's father. They raced this at Crystal Palace, Brands Hatch, all the early circuits, and John had actually 35 victories. I think from 37 starts on this bike, he had 35 wins. So John got a lot of experience with this bike. Double overhead cam, 250 twin, really way ahead of its time, and obviously with John's and his father's expertise, they really made it a winner.
At that time, the Italian and German companies dominated 250cc racing, but this engineer called Bob Geeson, basically in his garden shed, produced this very advanced twin-cylinder bike, overhead cams, plenty of power, fast, and invited John to ride it. And the two of them, John and Bob Geeson, got on very well. And John scores various successes on that bike on English short circuits.
The Honda people took great interest in this REG. The racing Hondas were very much influenced on the 250 twin cylinder double overhead cam REG.
The German NSU factory said, please race our 250cc Sportmax bike.
1955 Ulster Grand Prix. We were both on NSU Sportmaxes. John got a great start. I was held up for half a lap, then I was chasing John all the way. He won by 8 seconds and I was second, but it was the start of a great friendship.
When he was only 21, he won his first World Championship event, riding this 250cc NSU. So there's another thing that he's winning races. Now he's won his first World Championship race.
And Joe Craig eventually forgave John and offered him a factory-sponsored Norton. At Brands Hatch, towards the end of the 1955 season, John got another chance to fulfill his ambition to beat the great Jeff Duke.
Jeff Duke was regarded as the finest, smoothest, most successful rider of that era. And in '55 was riding the 500cc four-cylinder Gilera, which was also the finest Grand Prix bike of its time. Jeff Duke would bring the Gilera to England for just a small handful of meetings, just to ride it in front of the English fans. And it was John's ambition to try and beat Jeff Duke on his single cylinder, one cylinder against four, Manx Norton. Eventually, he achieved that at Silverstone and Brands Hatch at the end of the '55 season, which was his last season with Norton.
Really, at Brands Hatch, the four-cylinder Gilera was not the bike for there, but John's wonderful Nortons that he practiced and knew the circuit inside out. That was the place where he was going to have the success against the great Jeff Duke. This was John's favourite section of the museum, the Norton section, because John was a Norton man. This is the featherbed Norton, which again, John won umpteen races at all the English circuits. He beat the great Jeff Duke at Brands Hatch. Jeff Duke was on the Gilera. John was on the 500 single Norton. It was so nice to ride, it was like in a feather bed in your bedroom, so it didn't jump about all over the road. It handled beautifully, fantastic road holding. This put Norton's back on the road for quite a long period. Great, and of course John had umpteen successes on that bike.
Success on the racetrack comes from going round corners faster than anybody else. You've got to have a fast motorcycle as well, but it's the braking, the turn-in and the exiting that really makes a difference. And John was better at doing that than almost anybody else in his time.
He was so race prepared and so race aware. He had 35 victories on the REG before he went to his first Grand Prix. The race experience he had was phenomenal.
John had finally won a straight race against the world's best, Jeff Duke. And he'd won his first World Championship race. That year, he'd competed in a staggering 86 races, winning 70. A phenomenal achievement that didn't go unnoticed.
He had become the top British motorcycle rider on the home circuits. Count Augusta had obviously been told about this phenomenon in England and invited him to come to Gallerati, the MV factory headquarters in Italy, to talk about riding for MV in '56.
They had a test date sorted out, and on the morning of the test day, they woke up, looked out the window, and it was cloudy and it was raining. And the MV Augusta lads said, "Oh dear, we can't go testing today." And John said, "Well, why not?" And they said, "Well, it's because it's raining. We don't test in the rain." And John said, "Well, that's ridiculous. We race in the rain. We should test in the rain." They went testing. John was immediately quick on the bike, and the mechanics just ate out of his hand thereafter. They just adored him.
Count Augusta is motorcycling's equivalent at that time of Enzo Ferrari. So it's like entering, this hallowed place, the MV factory. During the interview, suddenly a woman dressed mainly in black enters the room, walks up to the Count's desk, turns and looks at the apprentice boy, and, has words in Italian with the Count, and leaves. And I believe that was the Count's mother who insisted on vetting who the Count was talking to. So obviously John passed the test, and he got invited to ride the MV for 1956.
It was pretty tough when he went out there. He was a kind of boy from South London who, it was him and his bike, and he went out there. And I think, it was the language, and of course it was different then. It was much more remote, really. You couldn't ring up. There's no mobile phones, no internet, no nothing. So when you were out there, you were pretty much on your own, and he had to really make a go of it. And it wasn't that long post-war either, so things were pretty. It was pretty poor everywhere, really, I think.
John started the 1956 season as the newest member of the Augusta family. His World Championship debut on an MV was also approached that same year at the world's most dangerous race, the Isle of Man TT.
Arturo Magni, the chief engineer of MV, and John put the bikes on a train in London and rode in the guards van with the bikes to Liverpool where, at Liverpool railway station, they unloaded the bikes and pushed them the 2 miles to the docks to get them on the ferry for the Isle of Man.
1956 had been a fantastic debut. First place on the 500cc and 4th on the 350.
Count Augusta Cities. We must buy you a present for winning our first World Championship. So I thought about this, and I went to Hockenheim and I saw this beautiful car in the paddock. And a man called Alex von Falkenhausen of BMW had this car, and he said, take it for a run. So I did a run, and immediately I got back, I thought, that's the idea. So I went to Count Augusta, I said, see, I would like to buy a 507 507 BMW, £3,200. He gulped and took a hesitation, so we did a deal on 50-50. So I ended up with 50% prize and 50% in 1957 when the car was delivered, and it's there on the grid today.
But the following season saw the return of Jeff Duke for Gilera. The MVs were no match for the Gileras. John did well to finish 3rd.
In 57 is an embarrassing scene that develops when John, on the factory MVs, is able to win only 1 Grand Prix, and he has 27 retirements on MV motorcycles, factory bikes, during that season. On the other hand, on his own personal Manx Nortons, he wins 10 times. So the Italian press started saying, Surtees doesn't need an MV to win races. Well, you know, this is really embarrassing for the Count. So from 58 onwards, John's more or less confined to racing MVs. Count says, no other make of motorcycle, please.
By the end of the season, Gilera and Moto Guzzi had withdrawn from Grand Prix racing. That left 1958 wide open for Surtees and the Augusta team.
John and this were a great combination. John's style and consistency, the MV's reliability and setup, which was an unbeatable combination.
Count Augusta would not allow him to go and do non-championship races. And in those days, there were only 5 or 6 World Championship Grand Prix races. So that would mean that without going and racing in non-championship events, particularly in the UK, where he could also get very good start money to appear, but without doing that, John found it hard to keep his hand in. And if you had 1 month between one Grand Prix race and the next, okay, you can go testing in the meantime, but you still want to race. And Count Augusta didn't want him racing anything other than an MV Agusta.
However frustrating the situation at MV, John rarely let his problems off the track affect his performance on the track.
The result was a great British triumph, the winner being John Surtees, number 50, who came in ahead of Hartnell and Chadwick.
Surtees was back on top for 1958, with another championship win for MV, and taking first place in almost every Grand Prix on 350 and 500cc, including the Isle of Man TT.
For 30 miles of the course, they've had their brakes hard on. Yet the winner's average speed is 102.44 miles per hour. And John Surtees is winner of the TT Senior event for the 3rd time in succession.
There was another championship for MV in 1959, but Count Augusta's ban on racing other bikes was taking its toll. John competed in just 17 races that year, compared to 86 in the previous.
Number 5, John Surtees, riding an MV Agusta in the junior event. 7 circuits of the course over 264 miles. And well ahead of the field, John Surtees wins the junior TT for the 2nd time running. The 25-year-old world champion was all set for a TT double. In the senior event, he was again riding an Italian Agusta number 4. But a high wind was a terrible hazard. Conditions were the worst ever, and over half the entry retired. But in spite of driving rain, Surtees finished with another TT double in the bag.
With no real challenges to his winning streak, John continued through 1960, chalking up another championship and a senior TT lap record. John Surtees thrived on competition, and with MV it was seriously lacking. But while the Count had banned him from riding other bikes, he'd said nothing about cars.
During 1960, he was still riding for MV Agusta, and he ended up with the 500 and 350 championship again. He had 7 motorcycle world championship titles.
He probably got bored from winning all the time. I mean, one of the great things about racing is having a good battle and beating your close rivals, and there weren't any.
John's interest in Formula One really began at the Sportsview Personality of the Year ceremony, when he was on the same table as the new British world champion racing driver Mike Hawthorn, and also 2 team principals, Reg Parnell, who was the manager of Aston Martin Racing, and the other one was Tony Vandervelde, who owned and ran the Vanwall Formula One team. And Mike Hawthorn said to John that really he ought to try his hand at racing cars, you know, because they were much more sensible than bikes, because they stood up on their own.
While at MV, John had regularly returned to England, driving all the way, cruising at 100 miles an hour in his BMW 507. It was an early taste for driving cars at speed. He'd grown up around bikes, building and racing them. He knew that world inside out. But the world of car racing was a relative mystery. It would prove a steep learning curve, the kind of challenge John Surtees thrived on.
I think essentially he chose 4 wheels over 2-wheel racing, simply because he'd been there, done that in the motorcycle racing world, achieved everything that essentially any sportsman could wish to achieve. What he wanted was the challenge.
It was just a lack of racing, you know, which is why he got into the car racing.
They wouldn't let him race any other bikes, so he said, all right, if I can't race bikes, I'll race cars. And there's nothing in the MV contract that stated that he couldn't race cars, so probably enjoyed the change. I think he'd been winning and riding bikes for a long, long time. He started when he was 16. So after that long period of success, it was a brand new challenge to go into Formula One. And there's no question he probably enjoyed taking on the Formula One lot and blowing them off as a motorcyclist.
Both Reg Parnell of Aston Martin and Tony Vandervelde offered him test drives to give him a bit of experience if he wanted, if he was interested. And John's ears pricked up, and yes, he was interested. And so he tried the Aston Martin sports car and he tried the Vanwall Formula One car and gained some experience in both of them.
Over the winter of 1959, John kept up his commitment to MV and motorcycle racing, while his car racing skills grew at a fearsome rate.
MV Agusta wanted to restrict my racing on motorcycles, so I thought, well, there's nothing in the contract to stop me driving 4 wheels. So I went to Cooper to buy a Formula 2 car, and a man stepped out the shadows, Ken Tyrrell, and promptly told me he'd entered me for the Goodwood event in a Cooper Austin Formula Junior, and that I should be on the grid. So he fixed up a license, and I came here. The car was unpainted. It wasn't quite finished, but I got it on pole, and I had a big dice with a certain person called Jimmy Clark. I actually had the lead, but then I made a mistake. I forgot I had 4 wheels and tried to go by someone who we were lapping and used a bit too much grass. But I managed to scramble back and nearly get up with him again, but I finished second.
He'd never really watched a motor race before, and this was the first one that he watched from beginning to end, and he watched it from the cockpit of his Cooper. John finished second, first time out. It was brilliant. And then bought himself a Cooper Formula 2 car to drive himself in the 1960 season. And they trailed it up to Alton Park for a Formula 2 race early in 1960. And John was absolutely sublime at Alton Park in that car first time out. And immediately Colin Chapman of Team Lotus was in touch saying, come and drive for us, come and drive for us. We'll give you a Formula One drive. And John drove for Team Lotus in the International Trophy and was very, very quick.
If we look at that incredible 1960 season, when he was going from Formula One car to Motorcycle Grand Prix to Formula 2 car, in that year he competed in 18 car races in 6 different cars and 14 motorcycle races. He got his first Formula One podium position in only the 8th car race of his life.
I was hopping on a bike like this one weekend and then jumping into Colin Chapman's Lotus another weekend.
John's first Grand Prix with Team Lotus at Monaco. Monaco is a circuit on which they don't race motorcycles, so it was completely new to him. You know, the car guys had a real advantage over him.
And a bit later that season, he scores his first Formula One pole position.
John rode bikes and raced cars the same day once, and that was at Solitude in Germany, when he won the West German 500 Grand Prix race on an MV Agusta, and he drove in the car race run the same day.
But during that 1960 season, I think his last win on a motorcycle was the Grand Prix des Nations at Monza. He was just loved by the Italian tifosi, you know. They called him Il Grande John, John the Great. The Italian press also christened him Figlio del Vento, the son of the wind. At Goodwood on Easter Monday 1961, John scored his first Formula One race win in the Glover Trophy, the feature race that Easter Monday. Driving a Cooper Climax run by the Bowmaker team, managed by Reg Parnell, who'd previously been his mentor while with Aston Martin back at the end of '59. And then 18 months later, you know, here he was winning at Goodwood in a Formula One car.
He went from the 1.9 mile Monaco street circuit. A couple of weeks later, he's on the Isle of Man mountain circuit on a 500cc motorcycle. It's unbelievable, the versatility.
But I remember his second race for Lotus was in the British Grand Prix at Aintree, and he finished second, and that was an incredible performance.
And Jack Brabham's the winner with 30 second.
The first race I ever saw in cars was the first race I took part in. So, and then my third race was a Formula One race, so it was a rather quick beginning.
It had been an incredible start to his car racing career. Pole position and second place to future Formula One champion Jimmy Clark at Goodwood. He made his Formula One debut at Monaco and came second in the 8th car race of his life at the Portuguese Grand Prix. At the same time, he successfully defended the 350 and 500cc motorcycle championships, including another win at the Isle of Man Senior TT. It would be his final year at MV. Still only 27, in 1961, John's reputation in car racing was growing and drew the attention of another Italian icon, none other than Enzo Ferrari.
And Mr. Ferrari was making offers to him very early on to come and join Ferrari, but John knew that he wasn't yet fully cooked as a racing driver. He knew that he didn't yet have sufficient experience to take on that role with somebody as prominent and as in the public eye as Ferrari. And he didn't want to let anybody down, especially himself.
John decided that he wanted to learn the ropes, and he knew that he wasn't going to learn the ropes with Ferrari because he would be expected to perform at the highest level from the very first race.
And so he had the 1962 season, for example, driving the Lola for Bowmaker Lola Racing. more or less as his own team, with the Lola car designed and made by Eric Broadley. And Eric Broadley was really the leading and most innovative chassis and suspension designer in the motor racing world, with the sole exception of Colin Chapman of Lotus.
Reg Parnell's team were running the first ever Grand Prix Lolas with backing from Bowmakers. John Surtees has high hopes of the new Lola.
Broadley produced cars that were exquisitely designed, very well made, much more robust than Lotuses. Lotuses were notoriously fragile because Colin Chapman was intensely focused on saving weight. There, he developed the Lola car to suit himself, John Surtees. I don't think that Colin Chapman would pay any attention really to what the driver told him. He had his own ideas.
In the 1962 German Grand Prix, it turned into a race-long battle between three cars. There was Graham Hill in a V8 BRM. There was Dan Gurney in a flat-8 air-cooled Porsche. And there was John Surtees in the V8 Lola with a Coventry Climax engine. It was rainy, it dried, it rained again, you know, it was a really challenging surface. It was a long race on what was accepted to be the most difficult road racing course in the world, with a 14-mile lap. It was all humps and bumps in the Eiffel Mountains. And they had a tremendous, tremendous battle. Graham Hill won it with John second and Dan Gurney third. And that really, I think, concentrated old man Ferrari's mind.
In 1962, John married his first wife, Patricia Burke, and continued honing his driving skills, ready to join Ferrari the following year. He led their Formula One and sports car teams.
I think John's skills translated so easily to four wheels simply through his intense competitiveness and his intense focus and his perfectionism.
I think one important factor in John's transition from two wheels to four was that he was sufficiently respected by Enzo Ferrari, and that meant that he allowed John to influence the way in which the Ferrari Formula One car was developed.
Mr. Ferrari always liked to have drivers on his team who had been frontline racing motorcyclists, and he knew darn well that the guys that had demonstrated sufficient sensitivity to race effectively in all kinds of weather conditions and all kinds of track conditions just had that innate feel for where the grip was. And that could be translated into the cockpit of a racing car. So if you were darn quick on two wheels, chances are you'll be really, really quick on four. And the best of those ex-motorcyclists like Tazio Nuvolari and Achille Varzi and Alberto Ascari and so on, all of whom began their careers racing motorcycles, they became brilliant, brilliant world-class racing drivers. And John Surtees was one of that number. When he went to Ferrari, he had the experience of his years with MV Agusta behind him. And the Ferrari boys had the knowledge that the man that was coming to them had been this great MV Agusta motorcycle rider. They expected a lot of him, and John was happy to deliver. And he delivered not only in the Formula One cars, he also delivered in the sports prototype cars, running the endurance races like the Sebring 12 Hours.
John's first race as a Ferrari factory driver was at the Sebring 12-hour sports car race.
The Surtees Scarpiotti car is now undisputed holder of first place. Mares Vaccarella second, and the Graham Hill Ferrari, now running without lights, is third.
He and his co-driver win the race, only to be protested, not by another team, by their own team manager, a person called Eugenio Dragoni. Dragoni claimed that another Ferrari team had covered more laps than John and his co-driver. That was dismissed and their victory was reinstated. But Dragoni wanted to develop an Italian driver he could call his own protege. But he always seemed to resent the English Leone doing so well. So there was this persistent political intrigue at Ferrari, and a lot of animosity developed between John Surtees and Dragoni.
And here's John Surtees' Ferrari. And from now till the end, the pace will get hotter. A Jag in trouble, but still running. And really going strong is the Rover BRM, soon to complete the 24 hours and win that special prize. Sterling Moss seen his Ferraris take the first 6 places.
He proved to be a very fine endurance racing driver because he had this inbuilt experience and mechanical sympathy and feel and touch. He would listen to every part of the machine around him, and he had that wonderful sympathy that is necessary for an outstanding endurance racing driver.
His win in endurance racing for Ferrari wasn't received in the way he'd hoped. It left a bitter taste, but John managed 2 more wins that season, at the Nürburgring and his first Formula One victory for Ferrari at the German Grand Prix. Ferrari's dedication to their sports car business meant endurance racing was crucial to sales and took priority over the development of their Formula One cars. The result was the early Ferrari 158 was a lot less competitive than its rivals.
What John did was take with him to Ferrari a lot of knowledge of Eric Broadley's chassis and suspension design, of what Colin Chapman had been doing with Team Lotus and why he'd been doing it. And essentially, it was John's influence that was required by Mr. Ferrari to bring Ferrari up to date with British state-of-the-art chassis and suspension design. Because until that time, Ferrari had regarded the engine of a racing car as being all it was about, and the chassis was merely a bracket to connect the wheels, and it had a hole in it where the man went, and that's all that most of the racing car was. Which meant that Ferraris, for years and years and years, have been really rather agricultural pieces of work. And the Brits had compensated for their lack of horsepower by building very light, very sophisticated cars with very advanced and sophisticated suspension systems. And essentially, things like the Lotuses and the Lolas could run rings around a Ferrari up to the end of 1962.
However competitive John made the car, he still had to fight for every little bit of success while at Ferrari. Their jingoistic team manager, Dragoni, constantly tried to undermine the Englishman's place on the team in favour of Italian drivers like John's own teammate, Lorenzo Bandini, and Giancarlo Baghetti.
Baghetti won the French Grand Prix after having won a number of early season non-championship races. And Baghetti was reckoned to be the great new chosen son of Italian racing and subsequently disappointed. Dragoni, however, became a great proponent of Lorenzo Bandini, being the new wave, the new generation of great Italian racing driver, in succession to the likes of Ascari and Villoresi and so on from the 1950s. Bandini was good, but he wasn't quite that good. And he wasn't quite that good in comparison to John, on the basis that in John's mind, Lorenzo Bandini offered no threat. John was very comfortable with him as a teammate. Dragoni, however, set out to manufacture a situation in which Bandini was advantaged by the team and John, the incoming Brit, the foreigner, was disadvantaged by the team. And that caused tremendous and growing friction.
The 1964 Formula One season didn't start well. The car, beset with mechanical problems, saw 3 early retirements and only 1 finish.
Well, in racing, you always need a little luck as well. And earlier in the year, we'd had some pretty foul luck. Partly because of the lack of preparation, but partly, I mean, for instance, I was leading comfortably the Austrian Grand Prix, and something you'd never imagine on a Ferrari, a front track arm broke. You know, it just was unheard of.
Endurance racing didn't fare much better. Again, mostly because of mechanical problems.
The 1964 World Championship season was quite remarkable, because it looks as if John Surtees and Ferrari didn't really stand a proper chance until the championship series was very well advanced. John suddenly popped up at the Nürburgring and won the German Grand Prix. That was pretty fantastic. And then they went to Austria for the Austrian Grand Prix.
A new event on a new circuit, the airfield at Zeltweg, which was, to say the least, very rough.
John himself, Graham Hill and Jimmy Clark had all suffered suspension collapses because that Austrian Grand Prix was run on the former NATO aerodrome at Zeltweg, and the joints in the concrete just smashed the suspensions of those little 1.5 litre cars to pieces. And Bandini managed to keep his car together long enough to win the race. So not only did Ferrari gain points there, Graham Hill of BRM and Jim Clark of Lotus were denied points.
The gap closing between John and the frontrunners, he was in with a fighting chance. There were only 3 races left in the season. The first, and arguably most important, was next. It would be a chance for Ferrari to win on their home turf at Monza, but John Surtees wasn't racing at peak physical performance. A recent crash at the Goodwood TT had left him with serious concussion.
John came into the St Mary's S-Bend to find a couple of other cars spinning like tops, and he hit one of them and somersaulted and rolled into the verge. And John was knocked out and suffered, what we now know to be a concussion, although I don't think it was terribly clear at the time. But he was advised not to go to the Italian Grand Prix and to drive in it, but he did.
McLaren later began to drop back, and Clark retired with a broken piston. When Gurney's car started misfiring, Surtees opened up a commanding lead. And so Surtees took his second win of the season.
To see Ferrari win, the home team, win the Italian Grand Prix at Monza is a huge thing. And he was suddenly in the World Championship with a shout. Mr. Ferrari, meantime, was in dispute with the Italian club because they'd failed to cooperate with him over accepting one of his latest GT cars as a GT car. Mr. Ferrari had turned in his entrance licence, so the Ferraris at Watkins Glen for the USGP and Mexico City for the Mexican GP weren't painted red at all. They were painted American colours, white and blue, and entered by Luigi Conetti's North American racing team, Conetti being the American importer for Ferrari.
To represent the car that I had in the Mexican Grand Prix, there is this car painted in blue and white.
As John entered the season finale, Graham Hill was on 39 points. John only had 34, with Jim Clark just behind him on 30. Everything hinged on the result of the next race at the Mexican Grand Prix.
The Mexican Grand Prix, the last one of the season, counting in the World Championship. The fame of Stirling Moss, how durable it is. The world's top drivers are all here. It's time for the balloon to go up. For the race to start, that is.
A notoriously rough track, harsh on suspension, and John feared Ferrari's fuel injection system would suffer from the extreme altitude found at the circuit. His practice laps didn't go well. One engine broke and the other was below par. He qualified second row in fourth. With the odds stacked against him, the championship looked lost.
The flag goes down, the field's away, his engine starts stuttering, he drops to 13th place.
Driving a Lotus is Jim Clark, champ last season, and again this time if he can win today. Graham Hill, BRM. Jack Brabham, a former champion, and the up-and-coming John Surtees, proclaimed Driver of the Year, Ferrari.
Graham Hill, in the BOM, one of his contenders, gets in a tangle with the other Ferrari driver, Bandini, and is not able to continue. Jim Clark goes out, the other title contender, with a mechanical problem. Vehicles were very unreliable in those days compared to today.
The whole race was decided really on the last lap.
Jim Clark had led up to the last lap, but a broken oil pipe forced him to retire.
Cruel luck for Clark, a broken oil pipe on the last lap.
With no competition, Dan Gurney moved to first place. John fought all the way up to fourth, and when Bandini and Graham Hill collided, he slipped past into second.
Mexico's loveliest film star, Lorena Velasquez, makes it a terrific afternoon for the winner. Sterling Moss points out that though Gurney won, John Surtees, by being second, becomes world champion.
John Surtees emerged as world champion.
The first person ever to win world championships on 2 and 4 wheels.
If it happened today, with live global TV coverage, it would be a wonderful outcome for the Formula One World Championships. The outcome for John Surtees was that he added the Drivers' World Championship to his Motorcycle World Championships, the only man ever to do so.
It was a worthy season for John Surtees because he's had all these technical difficulties. He dropped to 13th and fought back. Colossal opposition.
John Surtees had won the 1964 World Championship of Drivers and Ferrari the International Cup for Formula One manufacturers. He'd realised a lifelong ambition and become the first, the only person to win a championship on both 2 and 4 wheels. He'd also taken third place at Le Mans that same year, and throughout 1964 had been developing and racing the promising Lolas under the banner of Team Surtees outside of the championship circuit. With Ferrari's Formula prospects for the following season looking fantastic, entering 1965, John was in high spirits, but his nemesis, Dragoni, wasn't going to make life easy.
One of the great difficulties of driving for Ferrari during almost any period of their history has been the influence of the Italian specialist press, orchestrated for many years by Mr. Ferrari himself. In John Surtees' period, Eugenio Dragoni, the very xenophobic, jingoistic Italian team manager, manipulated the press, sometimes with Mr. Ferrari's approval and sometimes without, to being very, very critical of Surtees, and some of that did get to him. In 1965, Ferrari had a choice of either the existing World Championship winning 158, the V8 engine, 1.5 litre car, or the new 1512, which was the flat 12. The flat 12 was relatively unreliable, and John felt that he was being given the flat 12 by Dragoni when he should have had the V8 and would have done better with it. But the 1965 season, critically, was the final season of the 1.5 litre. Ferrari was looking at building a Formula One car for 1966 and develop an engine for Formula One that was based upon their 3 litre sports endurance racing engine. And John was disappointed by its size, its weight, its fuel consumption, because fuel consumption in the Formula One car at that time meant that you had to lug an awful lot of fuel around from the starting grid to the finish line.
It's the car that I won the World Championship with, but it's also the car that was the subject of me leaving Ferrari, because this is a car with a 2.4 six-cylinder engine in that I wanted to race in the new 3-litre formula.
John had been racing the Lola T70 throughout 1965, but on Friday the 24th of September, during a test lap at Mossport Park, Canada, John Surtees had the first serious accident of his career.
During 1965, John was also running Team Surtees, based in England, and running the new, utterly beautiful Lola T70s. And he and Jackie Stewart were running a pair of the cars by the end of the year. And they went off to Mossport Park in Canada for the Canadian Sports Car Grand Prix.
A very, very difficult and quite dangerous track.
Jackie was concerned by a strange feeling in his car. During practice, John took the car out for a run to see what it was like. A front suspension upright holding the wheel on broke. And it had obviously been in progressive failure. And it broke and spun the car off, and John ended up flying off the top of an embankment and down a drop.
His kidneys were smashed up, his back, his pelvis. It was a bit touch and go, and he got flown back to St Thomas's actually, and it was a long recovery. But I think it was 3 months, and he was racing again. John being John, he just bashed on and ignored it all.
His first race was Monza 1000 Kims in the wet.
Oh, he said, yeah, I couldn't get into the car myself, so they got an engine hoist to winch me in.
He would have set himself a target, surely not of winning, but certainly of, okay, maybe getting on the box. But to actually win the race and a grueling race after such terrible injuries, must have been hugely satisfying. Dragoni claimed that he wasn't fit enough to race and wanted to replace him with somebody else. That was John's perfect flick of the finger.
Dragoni sees his chance to advance the cause of Italian drivers, led by Lorenzo Bandini, within the Ferrari team, because their English team leader was so badly injured when he'd been driving this foreign car, this English car. And Dragoni was very suspicious of the fact that Surtees had been running the Lola sports cars, and was whispering in Mr. Ferrari's ear all the time, saying that Surtees is taking our technology to Lola. In 1966, John found that Bandini was being given a car that he thought he should have at the time of the Le Mans 24-hour race.
Ferrari had won Le Mans for 6 consecutive years. They wanted to keep their grip on that race.
With 9 wins since 1949, 6 consecutive wins during the past 6 years. By the mid-1960s, the name of the game at Le Mans had become Beat Ferrari. And in 1966, there was a new, strong challenger, the Ford GT.
These big 7-litre Fords were getting more and more competitive. Dragoni said to John, please set fastest lap in practice so that you start on pole and you go off and at a fast pace, almost like you're racing a Grand Prix, and we'll depend on the reliability of the Ferraris, of our Ferraris, to try and break the Fords. And at the last minute, Dragoni said to John, oh, you won't be driving the first shift. Scarfiotti, your co-driver, will be, because his father or his uncle is sitting in the grandstand, Italian politics. John explodes and he goes to his Ferrari 330 road car and abandons the team and the race and drives through the night to Maranello to see Enzo Ferrari.
They'd already had a situation at the Monaco Grand Prix where Bandini was given a car that John felt he should have driven. And John went to thrash it out with the old man and with Dragoni. And the result of that meeting was that John left the team immediately, just walked out. That was it, end of story. And there was one point a few years ago where I was with John at his home, and he suddenly said to me, I'm going to tell you something, he said, as long as you promise not to publish it. And he told me the real reason why he'd left Ferrari. And he said during that meeting, at one point Dragoni got exasperated and said to him, if you insist on staying with us and driving with us, I'm not going to be able to guarantee your safety. And John had already had instances where something like a spanner had been left lying in the engine that had jammed the throttle out. And there were other instances like that. He said something just clicked. Had that been deliberate? And he said once that element of trust has gone, you can't continue on that basis. What had been a love affair between Ferrari and John Surtees ended at that point.
Ford won Le Mans for the first time that year.
First place, the number 2 Ford GT. Second place, the number 1 Ford GT. Third place, the number 5 Ford GT.
Ferrari wasn't even placed.
That 1966 season was a very significant one in Formula One history because it was the first year of the new 3-litre capacity Formula One. From 1961 to 65, Grand Prix had been run to a 1.5-litre formula. For 66, they doubled the engine size. The first race in Monaco had been won by an enlarged 1.5-litre car. But the second race of that season, the Belgian Grand Prix, John dominated for Ferrari. His win in the Belgian Grand Prix was the first by a full 3-litre car specifically designed for the new 3-litre formula. The World Championship should have been in his grasp. It should have been in Ferrari's grasp. They lost John Surtees and lost the chance of the World Championship with him. Simple as that. John landed immediately in the Cooper team. The Cooper cars were powered by Maserati engines. Maserati were just round the corner from Ferrari in Modena and had been for many years Ferrari's deadly rival. The old man would have been pretty upset with him. Can't have sat comfortably at all. In the German Grand Prix, he qualified second fastest and he finished second. In the Italian Grand Prix, he qualified fourth, although he didn't finish there. And then in the American Grand Prix, he finished third. And they then went up to the Mexican Grand Prix for the end of the season. It's at 7,000 feet, and some engines respond quite badly. The Cooper Maserati actually responded very well. And John just drove magnificently. He drove his best race of the year. He qualified on pole. He took the lead from Jack Brabham on the 6th lap, and he won the race. He lapped everybody in that race, apart from Jack Brabham, which was a mark not only of the way in which John was such a determined driver, it was also a mark of John as a development driver because he contributed greatly to the development of that new 1966 car to make it competitive. Against all of this Formula One activity, you have the background of John with his Lola Chevrolet T70 sports cars attacking the inaugural Can-Am Championship in North America that year.
Drivers in those days were very versatile. They would compete in the Formula One Championship, the World Sports Car Championship, Le Mans. One of the events that John decided to enter was the 1966 Can-Am Championship, a relatively new series of 6 rounds that took place in the USA and Canada for the big V8 engine sports cars. And he decided to have a go at this. He's going to handle this Lola T70 and he's going to drive it.
And John did indeed win the inaugural Can-Am Championship with him.
And there's the checker for John Surtees. Stardust Grand Prix and Can-Am title to John Surtees, who averaged almost 110 miles an hour for the race and led it from wire to wire.
The following year, John was approached by a relatively new team. They were considering giving up Formula One, but their head, Yoshio Nakamura, told John they'd reconsider if he'd agree to join them as a driver and set up a new base at Team Surtees in England. They were called Honda.
In 1967, John joined forces with Honda, and Soichiro Honda, Mr. Honda, obviously saw the future of his company directed towards 4 wheels as well as two. He was always a motorcyclist. Who better to work with than a motorcyclist who had proved how successful he could be on two wheels by winning copious world championships? Let's go racing together on four wheels.
Well, when I joined Honda, they said to me, look, we have a very small budget and we have no organisation in Europe. You know, will you, with one hat, drive for us and help us with the development? And two, would you put people together to organise a team? So I ended up creating a team for them, and we had a little team based in Slough, and it was very encouraging actually that the engineers who were there both ended up being presidents of Honda.
While the initial Honda had a very fast V12 engine, it didn't handle at all, and it must have been pretty hard to drive. John, by then, knew what he needed to do to make the car work.
There's always a bit of variation here, and of course acquaint oneself with pieces of your life, like this car very much was.
Together, he and Eric Broadley produced the first Lola Honda, the Hondola as it was nicknamed, which Broadley and Surtees made together using the V12 Honda engine. And that won its first race at Monza in the Italian Grand Prix on Ferrari's home ground.
As they come up out of the south curve, the two cars are virtually neck and neck, but it's John Surtees ahead of Jack Brabham, and Jack Brabham pulls out.
I bet Enzo Ferrari really liked seeing his former world champion win his race on a car he essentially built himself with a Honda engine.
1967 had been an eventful year. 30 races in all, and lots under the Team Surtees banner. John entered 1968 with renewed vitality after a tough few years. But unfortunately, Honda didn't live up to expectations. The 1968 season saw serious development problems, and John refused to drive Honda's new magnesium chassis, RA302. He thought it was a death trap. At the French Grand Prix that same year, it crashed and burst into flames. The driver, Joe Schlesser, was killed. Honda withdrew from Formula One, but John Surtees' part in developing the Honda team was never forgotten. In 1986, when Nigel Mansell won the British Grand Prix, John received a telegram from Mr. Kume at Honda, thanking him, acknowledging that without his contribution, none of this would have been possible. After Honda, a short and dismal season with the Owen Racing organisation was the impetus for John to invest all effort into Team Surtees. The team had seen major success at the 1966 Can-Am, and they'd built the TS5 for American actor James Garner's racing team. It was one of the fastest Formula 5000 cars at the time. John Surtees, the racer, had become Team Surtees, the constructor.
We were in a chance with, I was at their line in possibly fourth place, having a little bit of battle with a certain Jackie Stewart, and the big ends went. But it was our fault. We got the oil tank design wrong, too much surge, and that was it. But then I was able to win a couple of non-championship races with it, including the Gold Cup, and so that was a good start.
Team Surtees built 100 racing cars in those 8 seasons. That is a lot of racing cars by the racing car industry standards. Their Formula 5000 cars were successful. Mike Hillwood won the 1972 European Formula 2 Championship in a Surtees. They were on the pace. What John couldn't get was the funding, the budgets, to enable him to compete at the highest level. The whole situation really wore him out. There was money that had been promised from Bang & Olufsen, the stereo people, wasn't forthcoming, and they struggled along, and eventually he had to pack it up.
Team Surtees had designed and manufactured numerous cars, but the failure of a major sponsor to deliver its promise of investment in '74 pushed the team to the brink of financial ruin. The stress took its toll on John's personal life. He divorced Patricia Burke in '79 and married his second wife, Janice Shearer, that same year. They divorced in 1982. He found love with his third wife, Jane Sparrow, with whom he had 3 children, Leonora, Edwina, and Henry. And John eventually agreed to sell his position in the Formula One Constructors Association to Frank Williams. Team Surtees came to an end.
When his team closed, he totally turned his back on racing. He didn't really have anything to do with it at all for years, actually.
And I think during that time, he was just totally devoted to fatherhood. And actually the fact that it came along later in life for him was perfect, because it meant that his early life was so focused on motorsport. And, you know, perhaps if he'd have had children earlier in life, he wouldn't have been able to have the same commitment to fatherhood that he had. He sort of approached fatherhood like every other aspect of his life, with just total focus, total commitment. Nothing was too much trouble. It was sort of like having a constant cheerleader for you, just encouraging you through everything.
John gradually renewed his connection with the motorcycling world, doing demonstrations and attending classic events across the world. He also spent a lot of time supporting his son Henry's burgeoning karting career. And John returned to Goodwood, the scene of many of his early races. Initially, he helped build the classic motorcycle side of the world-famous Festival of Speed, eventually becoming an integral part of the scene.
The very, very first car race he ever saw was actually at Goodwood, and he was in the car, amazingly, and I think he came second. John was an incredibly modest, lovely man, and he played a big part in what we did at Goodwood, of course, with the Festival of Speed, running the motorcycle side of things as he did, being a patron of the event.
I think that Goodwood was definitely, not that his passion needed reigniting for motorsport, but I think it's just that his life had sort of taken him on a bit of a different direction. I think as we became a little bit older and things like Goodwood kicked off, there was more of an awareness of these celebrations of motorsport and also classic racing.
My very first memory of John, I think, was actually, fun enough, his signature, because as a small boy I used to run around the pits at Goodwood, always collecting all the drivers' signatures, and had my little book, and I remember very well seeing John's signature and having it in there. But I guess I first met John then too, when he was racing at Goodwood in the early 60s.
In the early days of Goodwood, he had such a big involvement and worked very closely with Lord March. He organised all of the motorcycling aspects of the first Festival of Speed.
John was a great doer and always passionate about motorcycles, perhaps more than anything else. So I think when I asked if he'd help me with the motorcycle content at Goodwood, he was really keen to get stuck in. And unlike most people where we would have probably been given a list or something and we would have gone off and tried to do it, he actually delivered it all. In fact, it needed to be done pretty much by John's rules and regulations. I'm sure it wasn't. So it was going to be done his way or no way, which is the right way to do it, really.
He and his mechanic, Ian Skinner, they were always working on beautiful, exotic, classic racing motorcycles. Nortons, MVs. His engineering skills were still being deployed.
I was buying bikes for him at auctions and stuff, you know, and he was just putting them away. He loved me finding these rare Nortons and stuff that he, you know, the Artie Bells and the McCandless Nortons and the REGs and stuff like that. You know, it was just and he had a ride on that and couldn't believe it. And, you know, happy memories, you know. We worked together on this project quite closely. They call it the Norton Kneeler because you kneeled in the bike. Like this here, that's at Mallory Park with yours truly on it. John was very enthused about this Norton, and of course it broke 60 world records at Montlhéry with the great Ray Am.
He was always fiddling around with the bikes if they weren't working properly, or I mean, he'd repair them all at home before he brought them in his own workshop.
I mean, all sorts of people go to the Goodwood Festival of Speed. They would be amazed to see this silver-haired elderly man peeling out of a car suit and putting on motorcycle leathers, or the other way around. And going, what? And it was John Surtees, because only he would ride both cars and bikes at the Goodwood Festival Speed.
John drove actually quite a lot of other cars too at Goodwood. He just loved experiencing machines and driving and riding new things. And I know he was a very much favoured driver for Mercedes-Benz, and you know, they let very few people in the world drive their sort of pre-war Grand Prix cars.
When the classic scene started, and Mercedes, for example, would bring their 1937 5.6 litre supercharged car, 560 horsepower on narrow tyres at the back.
I'm having rather a holiday, actually, because, as you know, I've normally been very deeply involved in the motorcycles and such like. Well, this year I'm not. I'm actually going to go around and look at a few of the things which go on and enjoy some of it with my family and just concentrate purely on the Mercedes-Benz.
And then they would also bring the car with which Fangio won the 54-55 Formula One World Championship, which is known as a straight eight. And the pre-war cars had a centre throttle pedal and a right-hand brake, and the post-war cars had a conventional middle brake. So the drivers that Mercedes asked to come and test these things, they would stick to one or the other, pre-war, post-war, except John Surtees. He would drive both.
Mainly, it's just a question of getting together with this old beast again and sort of seeing what it's like up the hill. It skips around, but it'll be interesting.
You know, he was having to slide these to keep the spectators happy. You're having to slide the tail out.
So, yeah, I'm driving the W125 again. The Mercedes, of course, of Caracciola, and so I'm sort of imagining myself, you know, what he would have done with it, and at the same time telling myself, throttle in the centre, brake on the right, and so I go along the track muttering to myself to ensure I don't get the pedals wrong.
I remember the head of Mercedes Museum at that time, he turned to me and said, "Only John can do this."
You can't live with nostalgia all the time, but for brief moments like coming here for the weekend, you can go around and see virtually what is the heritage of motorsport, both 2 and 4 wheels. It's a very special event.
I think his last motor race was at Revival. He drove a lovely 250 LM. It was like an absolute masterclass. It was an amazing thing to watch. It was John just saying, look, okay, I've held back for a few years, but I'm just going to show you amateurs now how this is done. And boy, he just took everybody out. It was a tour de force. Everyone just watched it, jaws dropping.
Unless you think that Surtees is starting to ease off, look at the angle that green Ferrari takes up as he swings it down towards St Mary's. It's so smooth, but when you look at the attitude of the car's wheels and suspension, you realise that he is driving that car very near the limit. And a lot of empty tarmac behind John Surtees, the comfortable leader. There he is, lights ablaze. He's on his 10th lap.
By 2009, John's son's racing career had progressed. Henry was now racing in World Formula 2 championships. But at Brands Hatch in July that year, tragedy struck. An errant wheel broke away during another car's collision with the barrier. The wheel bounced onto the track and hit Henry. He was pronounced dead later that day. John and his family made sure Henry's death wasn't in vain. His legacy lives on in the Henry Surtees Foundation and the karting track he and his father went to when Henry was a young boy, Buckmore Park.
I think initially the Henry Surtees Foundation was very much a way for my dad to sort of continue working with my brother to really provide assistance for people that have had any sort of brain or physical injury and to provide them with the support to get back to community living and to really be able to live life as well as possible. We've worked now with a total of 9 different air ambulances, which pretty much covers the whole of the UK, providing them with equipment for blood transfusion machines so that they can take the blood transfusion and make that happen at the site of the accident. The more that you can do at the site of the accident, the more time that you can save for that patient, the more chance they have of surviving, but also surviving with a better quality of life. There are lots of different charities and partners that we work with, And it's extremely rewarding that to date we've raised just under £2.3 million, and obviously this was all from my father's vision to create something in Henry's memory. The sort of connection with Buckmore started sort of formally in 2000. He's had an involvement sort of in Buckmore ever since. The thing that was very special to him about Buckmore is that he was always an incredibly emotional person, so there was a real emotional connection to Buckmore. The track had been getting a little bit run down, so he really saw an opportunity to be able to actually invest and redevelop and re-energise. Probably most of the established British racing drivers would have karted at Buckmore Park. We've had Jenson Button kart here. Lewis Hamilton was actually discovered by Ron Dennis here at Buckmore Park on one of the rounds of the championship that he was in. Really what my dad wanted to see was just people coming here and seeing that enjoyment, that spark and that passion, about opening people's eyes to the grassroots of motorsport, and particularly for juniors thinking about how can I be involved in this industry. It doesn't mean that I'm going to be the next Lewis Hamilton, but you know, could I get interested in the engineering side, or could I be interested even in the business side of motorsport, or even just on a basic level, just creating a passion for something, you know, rather than necessarily being at home on video games, actually getting here and feeling the car under you as you drive around the track. And that was really important for Dad, actually providing those experiences.
Our commentator here at Buckmore Park is Keith Hewen.
Right into the lead, James Holman, the poleman, gets away at the front, but he's under a load of pressure. Number 9 is Holman. Fraser Sheeder coasts his way round the outside. Lewis Hamilton goes up into second place. Well, if you dilly-dally around in front of Lewis Hamilton, he will just move through. James Holman leads. Lewis Hamilton in second place. Russell Parks is in third place at the moment. Over the line then, Holman. Holman is out. That is such cruel luck. Holman puts his hand in the air and Lewis Hamilton goes through. So he's been gifted first place. Russell Parks has done everything he can to pass, but it's going to be Lewis Hamilton. The run into the line then. Hamilton takes the checkered flag. Parks is in second place. Alex Lloyd is in third. What a race. In fact, I would go as far as saying that is the best race of the year and certainly one of the better mannered.
In a career spanning 4 decades, John Surtees won Sportsman of the Year. He became an FIM Grand Prix legend, was inducted into the MotoGP Hall of Fame and the Motorsport Hall of Fame, and was awarded the Seagrave Trophy, an MBE, an OBE, and a CBE. He founded the Henry Surtees Foundation and was an ambassador for the Racing Steps Foundation. He led a successful racing team with major successes in the USA at Can-Am and the Indy 500. John Surtees raced in a total of 621 races, winning 290 with 103 podiums. He became the first man to win the Isle of Man TT 3 times in succession. He won 7 motorcycle world championships and a Formula One world championship. And to this day, he is still the only man to have won world championships on both 2 and 4 wheels.
It's the braking, the turn-in, and the exiting that really makes a difference. And John was better at doing that than almost anybody else in his time.
He was always passionate about what he was doing and very youthful in his outlook. I never heard him say, I'm too old for that. I think he still felt like he was about 15, actually.
He was only 26 when he quit motorcycles. He could have carried on winning relatively easy world championships for MV into the 1960s. He gave that up.
He was a racer, born and bred, from the age of 15, passengering his dad's sidecar.
I think people who are really, really successful, it's not just that they've got the ability or the skill. I think it's more than that. It's like a whole package that comes together.
A speed of reflex and a speed of appreciation and understanding and perception, which is way beyond mortal man, quite honestly.